Opposition fighters are gaining ground in northwest Syria. They've captured some major government-held cities and are aiming to take Damascus. How big a setback is this for President Bashar Al-Assad? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Neave Barker. The balance of power may be shifting in Syria, years after President Bashar Al-Assad regained control of some major cities. In just a week, opposition forces in the northwest have overrun Aleppo and Hama, and they say they have their sights now set on Damascus. The assault is led by the armed group Hayat Tahrir al Sham. It says the fighters are responding to attacks by government troops on its stronghold, Idlib. The Syrian military is reinforcing its lines of defence, and allies, Iran, Hezbollah and Russia, are promising to help. But can it push back the opposition advance? Is Assad's government really under threat? And what does this flare-up after a period of relative calm mean for millions of Syrian civilians? We will discuss these issues with our experts. But first, this report by Mohammed Haji.
This is the moment opposition fighters in Syria captured Hama, one of the largest cities in the country. The fighters have made significant gains in just 1 week, taking major towns and cities. The forces, led by the Hayat Tahrir al Sham armed group, received a heroic welcome. There were emotional scenes after opposition forces freed what they said were political prisoners and reunited them with their families.
I'm from Hama. May God save us from the government. About 1,500 people were imprisoned, with nearly 50 in each room. May God burn their hearts as they've burned ours.
After capturing Hama, this is what the leader of Hayat Tahrir al Sham had to say.
I inform you, my brothers, the Mujahideen fighters have begun to enter Hama to cleanse the wound that has endured in Syria for 40 years. I ask God Almighty to make it a conquest with no revenge, but a conquest of mercy and fellowship.
The capture of Hama came after days of heavy fighting with the Syrian army, which has been supported by Iranian-backed fighters and Russian air power. The opposition forces have now taken control of several major cities, including Aleppo, which is on a major highway that connects the capital to the northern coast. Syria's defense minister, however, insists the military's retreat from Hama was to allow his forces to regroup.
I would like to confirm that what happened in Hama is only a tactic. Our forces are still surrounding the outskirts of the city, and they are highly prepared to carry out all their constitutional and national duties.
This is the biggest challenge to the Assad government in years. It also comes at a time of uncertainty in the region. Assad's allies Iran and Hezbollah have been embroiled in a conflict with Israel over the past year, and Russia has been escalating its attacks in Ukraine.
The opposition, they sense an opportunity, a window of opportunity here in order to change the balance of power on the ground. You know, the Syrian regime has been resisting all calls for political solution to the crisis since 2018.
Hama has long been a stronghold of the opposition to President Bashar Al-Assad, and his father Hafiz, who was responsible for the Hama massacre that killed 40,000 people in 1982. The war in Syria has long been dormant, with several sides holding on to their regions. But the developments of the past week show the situation on the ground can change very quickly. Mohammed Haji, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Well, our guest today can provide deep insights into why the fall of Hama and other government-controlled towns and cities is so significant in Istanbul, although he's normally based in London. Hayat is a Syrian columnist and academic. Also on the road and in Ankara, Jerome Drevon is the senior analyst on Jihad and modern conflict at the International Crisis Group and author of the book From Jihad to Politics, How Syrian Jihadis Embrace Politics. And here in Doha, Mehran Kamrava is Professor of Government at Georgetown University, Qatar, and a prolific scholar on the Middle East and Iran. A very warm welcome to Inside Story to all three of you. Jerome, I wonder if I can start with you. The picture, as we know, is rapidly changing, isn't it, in Syria? At the time of recording, opposition forces have taken Aleppo, Hama. Homs appears to be teetering, possibly next. We're already hearing that some Assad loyalists may be starting to leave the capital, Damascus, as well. Jerome, firstly, in strategic terms, how do you explain these lightning advances by the Syrian opposition?
I mean, this is something extremely significant. Just a week ago, the armed opposition managed to take control over all of Aleppo just in a few days. Now taking over Hama, potentially going into Homs. So this is extremely significant because those places have never been controlled by the armed opposition. The city of Hama demonstrated in favor of opposition to the Syrian regime in 2011. Hundreds of thousands of protesters took peacefully to the streets, but the armed opposition never managed to get close to the city. So this is the first time that the armed opposition managed to control such a piece of land. Also, with much more coordination than before. The armed opposition is much more organized, coordinated, doing it mostly by itself. And those are very, very impressive achievements that I don't think even the armed opposition itself did not expect to move forward so quickly, nor did the regime or its allies or even the international community.
So clearly the element of surprise has been hugely important here. Hayat, as a man born and raised in Aleppo, how do you see this? What do these gains mean, particularly for the fate of the capital, Damascus?
First of all, thank you for having me. I think, as Jerome mentioned, they are very significant because if you look, for example, at Hama, the importance of capturing Hama is not only related to the strategic significance of Hama itself, which would allow them to capture Homs and potentially cut the sort of routes and connections between Damascus and the coastal area, but it also shows that what happened in Aleppo is not only limited to northwestern Syria, but now all the eyes are basically on Homs and potentially later maybe even Damascus. So it shows that how fragile the regime is and the potential of advancing all the way to Damascus.
Mehran, how do you explain in military strategic terms how Hayat Tahrir al Sham, or HTS as we will call it for the rest of the programme, has been able to sustain this pressure on Bashar al-Assad and his forces?
Well, obviously, the Syrian army has been weakened because of more than a decade of warfare. And of course, its primary patrons and supporters, Iran, Russia, Hezbollah, themselves are weakened or their attention is diverted. Iran is locked in a tit-for-tat with Israel. We're still waiting to see if the third round of Iranian attacks on Israeli targets will ever materialize. Probably not. Hezbollah has been tremendously weakened militarily because of Israel's invasion and devastating war on Lebanon. And of course, Russia is diverted in Ukraine, and Russia's abilities in Syria are limited really to airstrikes. And so what we see is a very disciplined militia organization that has been taking its time, knows the lay of the land, knows the psychologies that are involved, the sensibilities of people. So far, the leaders have been saying all the right things to gain popular support among the people, and they appear to have on-the-ground, street-level legitimacy, which the government is sorely lacking. So that explains the rapid advance in many ways.
We're talking about rapid advance. Let's show our viewers the lay of the land with a map of the situation in Syria at the moment that shows those key advances by opposition forces. Obviously, their stronghold has always been Idlib. They've obviously taken Aleppo and are pushing down that M5 highway. The distances between these cities is not very far at all. Between Hama and Homs, it's only about a 45-minute drive. Between Homs and Damascus, we're looking at about 2 hours on the road. very, very concentrated area where these advances are happening at lightning speed. Hayat, what is clear, as we've just heard, is that the Russia-Iran-Assad axis is deeply, deeply vulnerable right now, isn't it? I mean, HTS seems to have seized the initiative. Russia clearly distracted and stretched over the war in Ukraine. Iran, Hezbollah, distracted by what's been happening in Lebanon. Are Assad's forces and those who support him able to significantly regroup, do you think, to push back the opposition?
I think this is a question that many people are trying to answer right now. But the answer to the question, I don't think it lies within Syria. It lies mostly elsewhere, because it will mainly depend on the ability of Assad to gain or attract or encourage, pursue, whatever you want to call it, his allies to double down and send more resources, whether those resources are coming as in terms of boots on the ground, military equipment, or airplanes and airstrikes. So far, the regime has not been able to gain as much support as the regime wants and need in order to recapture, or at least start with defending those areas, let alone recapturing. However, what we have seen in the past few days does not mean that the regime might not be able to do so, because now the risks are higher, not only for the regime, but for its supporters as well. If you look at Homs, we are talking about the main supply lines to Hezbollah in Lebanon. We are talking about the area that is basically connecting the coastal areas where Russian forces are based and Damascus. So it's the stakes are higher for the regime, for Iran, and for Russia as well. And that's maybe could be a potential sort of factor behind sending more forces to support Assad. However, even if they're able to send more forces, I think that the question then becomes: will those forces be used to just defend the areas currently under the control of the regime in order to prevent opposition groups from advancing to new areas, or will then they will be used to start reversing opposition gains and recapturing the areas they were lost? All of that is still yet to be sort of seen. But so far, what we are seeing on the ground is that the regime is still not able to defend the ground, the areas they're controlling, and maybe we might be able to see more defeats and more gains for opposition groups, especially.
Jerome, the Assad leadership has shown throughout the civil war that it is very capable of scorched earth counter-offensives. As the opposition forces push south towards traditional Assad strongholds, areas where there's a large Alawite population, the Assad family being part of that community, what do we anticipate the state response to be?
I think it's going to be extremely difficult for the state to respond, because if you look at it historically, by 2015, the regime could have actually fallen down. The regime only survived because, first, Russia intervened with aerial support, and second, a large array of foreign militias allied with the regime, from Lebanese Hezbollah to Iraqi Shia militias and so on, intervened on the ground. So now what the recent events are showing is that without these two types of support, the regime cannot actually handle the situation by itself. And it's quite unlikely that the situation of 2015 will repeat itself now. Russia does not have the same resources. Russia has different interests now as well in Ukraine. Second, the Iraqi militias are not present the way they used to be in Syria. They are occupied elsewhere. And also Iran is looking for potentially what will happen with the forthcoming American administration. It does not necessarily want to reiterate what happened in the past. So in the meantime, it becomes extremely difficult for the regime because increasingly it is losing resources, material resources, weaponry, tanks, munitions, etc. It is also losing part of its soldiers. Some of them are giving up themselves to the armed opposition, and it is losing simply the military initiative.
Right.
And when we are looking at the militants fighting for Homs, for Aleppo, we speak about militants who want to come back home, of people who were expelled from their places, and the will to fight is simply much stronger on their side than on the side of the regime.
Mehran, just following on from what we've just heard from Jerome there, I understand that Assad has reportedly ordered a 50% pay rise to bolster his forces involved in this counter-offensive. Given that the Syrian economy has shrunk with state services on their knees, I mean, what does a move like this say to you?
It indicates utter desperation. There are videos circulating that show that the Syrian soldiers are simply handing over their weapons. I think it's important to remember that for the last 12, 13 years, we've had a war economy in Syria, and the Syrian state, has been singularly unable to, in many ways, provide services and basic economic needs for Syrians across the territory, but only in cities and in areas that it has controlled, which, as we've seen over the last week, has progressively shrunk. But Neave, if I may, I think it's important to remember, as my colleagues have said, that we seem to be at the precipice of probably what will be tectonic changes in the strategic map of the region. If indeed Homs falls, Iran will lose its strategic foothold in Syria and in Lebanon. And in that case, it's likely, very likely, to eventually go nuclear sooner than later. Then we have neo-Ottomanism on the part of Turkey, and kind of Turkey really throwing its weight as a regional superpower. And of course, tragedy and civil war will continue in Syria, because it's one thing to invade and attack and capture a city. It's quite another to be able to hold on to it and administer it. So it could very well be that we're on the verge of something really major in the Middle East that will significantly change the strategic landscape for a number of years to come.
If we are indeed experiencing tremors before a major earthquake across the region, it'd be really good to understand what these tremors actually mean and why they started, Jerome. I'd like to talk about HTS in particular and its leader, Abu Al-Jolani. I mean, the group formally pledged allegiance to Al-Qaeda. Al-Jolani is believed to have previously worked for Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the former leader of ISIL. Jerome, as part of your research, I understand you have spoken to some key figures in the opposition in Syria. I mean, how would you explain the journey that HTS and indeed Al-Jolani has made in becoming the preeminent power in northwest Syria?
By being politicians. When we look at Abu Muhammad al-Jolani, we often mentioned his ideology. What does he believe in? Is he pragmatic? Does he believe in those new changes and so on? I think we should focus on him as for what he is. He's a politician. He has understood that his previous allegiance to Al-Qaeda, to Islamic State, that was a strategic mistake that does not lead to anywhere. That's not a project that he believes in. And ultimately, he has taken his group from a small, elitist, Salafi jihadi group to what now is a large armed opposition movement that supports a civilian administration in a big part of Syria, and that's willing to play a role for the future of Syria. He had also proven to be quite an intelligent politician in a give and take approach to a range of actors, being able to also make concessions to the population that lived under the control of his group. And now it's a turning point for him. What's next? Because this is a major challenge for him, controlling Aleppo, controlling Hama, potentially controlling Homs. All the eyes are on him, both from the international community, from people in the region, but also from people who still live under the regime. And I think people are willing to to look at what he's going to do. The first steps were very positive in terms of the declaration, the statements towards the range of actors. But now the question is going to be, what is going to happen? Is he going to follow through his pledge to the communities, to the international community of states? And that's really the question mark that remains now.
Following on from what Jerome just said there, of course, it's one thing to take or seize control of these cities. It's a very different thing to govern, isn't it? Do you think HTS has the capacity to do that?
Right now, it's difficult to see a case in which they can control and govern all those areas in one go, especially if they do so through the current Salvation government structures. Because if you look at the scale of the areas they have captured, they are bigger than the areas they have used to control in northwestern Syria. They don't have the financial resources, manpower to be able to capture them. So without much needed help from the international community in terms of humanitarian aid, in terms of non-humanitarian support in order to restore services, provide essential services there, ensure that essential commodities like water, electricity, and bread are provided, it'll be difficult for HTS to really shoulder all of that on its basically by itself alone. However, this is a test that I think only the coming days and weeks will be able to show us and reveal, because if Al-Jolani is able to really convince them that there is a third way that is not directly linked to cooperating directly with the group and himself, then maybe that will attract more support and more funding. And basically, in absence of that, it'll be difficult for them to defend and provide adequate services in those areas.
Right. Maran, it appears as if HTS are trying to also create some sort of social movement as they storm through these particular towns by particularly releasing prisoners. Do we imagine that there will be some kind of upswell from the grassroots in cities like Aleppo and in Hama and in Homs in support of these opposition fighters? And also, they have tried to make it clear to people in these particular towns that they've taken that this isn't a war of religious conquest. Of course, given the group's past associations, should minorities believe them? Should Christians, should Alawites believe them?
Well, the proof is in the pudding. I think, as we just heard, the next couple of weeks would be very consequential. People really are tired of war, and civil wars have a cycle. They intensify and then they peter out. The tragedy of Syria has been prolonged because of the involvement of so many foreign actors. And I think the Syrian people want to see how any government, any ruler will impact their daily lives on a day-to-day basis as they go to the grocery store, as they have running water, electricity. So I think if the new movement can deliver services on the ground, can provide safety, security, food, water, electricity, then I think there would be a groundswell of support.
Of course, gentlemen, while we discuss the political and military implications of all of this, once again, we're looking at a massive upheaval when it comes to the daily lives of tens of thousands of people across Syria. Fighting, we understand, has displaced huge numbers of people already. Jerome, are we looking at another major humanitarian catastrophe at the moment?
Not necessarily, because, the opposition has really pushed further south, and the human catastrophe would happen if regime forces managed to push them back in the north. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I doubt that the regime has the ability to do so. The regime and potentially the Russians as well can bomb some of these places, bomb Aleppo, bomb Idlib, and it has done so, and that's possible. But to take over these these places, first, I don't think it's possible. And second, I highly doubt that a country like Turkey would allow that to happen. Because ultimately, most of the refugees that are in Turkey, and we speak about millions of people, do come from Aleppo, they come from Saraqeb, from Norman, etc., from those cities. And Turkey cannot accept for these cities to be retrieved by the regime once more, and for the population to be pushed back. So I think that ultimately those places will be saved. What will happen to the regime, that's still to be decided. But from Hama to the north, I think that will remain in the hand of the armed opposition for the time being.
And Mehran, the region, as we know, is clearly already hugely overheated. How might what's happening in Syria affect the wider Middle East and further afield, even potentially as far as Europe? Are there any fears? Jerome seems to think not, but are there any fears in your mind of an exodus of people?
Well, there's always a possibility of fears of exodus of people. We've already heard reports that people are leaving Damascus. If the revolutionaries, the rebels, move down towards Damascus, I think then we'll have to wait and see how the people of the capital would react, whether or not they'll stay or they will try and go to Lebanon, a country that is already burdened with tens of thousands of Syrian refugees, or Jordan for that matter. I think also the rebels are not a tested and proven set of administrators, and I think given their Islamist or their extremist background, that's extremely worrying for a number of regional actors. Certainly the Gulf states are worried. Of course, we've already talked about Iran, but there's fears of the unknown, of course.
Right. Hayat, I'd like to finish with you talking about the unknown and what regionally countries here are making of it. I mean, this offensive comes shortly after an rapprochement had started to emerge between some Arab nations and Bashar al-Assad. Assad was in Riyadh recently. He had a chance to speak there. What does it all mean for Arab states to see Assad under such substantial pressure? Do they now back away quietly and see what happens?
I think for now, at least if you look at the statements that were shared by Arab officials over the past week or so, they were still showing support for the regime. Now, whether that will continue now in light of recent regime defeats in Syria is yet to be seen. I think the major issue right now is that I think everyone is trying to figure out how risky the situation is for the regime and whether Assad will be able to maintain power despite these defeats. And I think the answer to that will then help them shape their position, whether to just take a step back and disengage from the whole Syria file or double down in support of the regime in the hope that that might protect and save the regime.
Okay. That's the end of our discussion, gentlemen. It's been a pleasure to have all three of you on Inside Story. Hayat, Jerome, Drevon, Mehran, Kamrava. We are simply scratching the surface right now, coming to terms with how speedily all this has happened. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on X and Instagram. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Neave Barker, and the whole team, it's bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.